Racist white woman humiliates a black man on the plane, and then his true identity is revealed. Flight 287 to Los Angeles hummed steadily at 30,000 feet. Detective Tom Johnson carefully checked his heart medication, a routine he'd performed countless times before. 3 rows back, Karen White's knuckles whitened as she gripped her magazine, her eyes fixed on the black man near the emergency exit. The crisp air of the pressurized cabin carried whispers of unease as she watched him check his bag again. People like him, she muttered, memories of her daughter's death flooding back. Neither passenger knew that this 5-hour flight would unravel a web of prejudice, loss, and an unexpected trafficking operation that would change both their lives forever. Before diving into this powerful story of prejudice and redemption, please take a moment to share your location in the comments and hit the like button. Your engagement helps us reach more viewers. Detective Tom Johnson's weathered face carried the weight of 15 years in law enforcement, but it was the past 3 years that had truly shaped him. His wife Sarah, a brilliant emergency room doctor, had died because of a racist hospital administrator who accidentally delayed her critical care after a car accident. The memory of holding her hand as she slipped away still haunted his dreams. Now at 42, Tom had channeled his grief into becoming one of New York's most effective undercover detectives, specializing in human trafficking cases. His personal tragedy had opened his eyes to the systemic prejudices that allowed criminal networks to exploit society's most vulnerable. He'd learned to wear his pain like armor, maintaining an unshakable calm that made him exceptional at his work. The current case had consumed 6 months of his life. A trafficking ring was moving victims through commercial flights, hiding them in plain sight using corrupt airline staff. Tom had painstakingly gathered evidence, building a case that could save dozens of lives. The flash drive in his medication bag contained data that could bring down the entire operation. His heart condition wasn't just a cover story. The stress of Sarah's death had left him with cardiac issues requiring daily medication. Rather than slowing him down, the condition had taught him patience and precision. Every move was calculated, every reaction measured. He'd learned that survival sometimes meant staying calm in the face of prejudice, letting ignorance wash over him while keeping his eyes on the larger mission. Today's flight to Los Angeles was supposed to be the final piece. He would rendezvous with his team, hand over the evidence, and help coordinate raids on multiple locations. The operation had to go perfectly. Lives depended on it. What he hadn't counted on was the woman 3 rows back, whose suspicious glares he'd noticed the moment he boarded. Tom recognized the look in Karen White's eyes. He'd seen it countless times before, fear masked as righteousness, prejudice disguised as concern. Usually he could handle such situations with practiced ease, but today was different. The stakes were too high, and the evidence too crucial to risk any confrontation. His mind drifted to the victims he'd interviewed, their stories of exploitation and survival driving him forward. One young woman's words particularly haunted him: "Nobody saw us because they chose not to look." It reminded him of Sarah's last words: "Make them see, Tom. Make them understand." The badge in his pocket felt heavy, a symbol of the justice he'd sworn to uphold, but experience had taught him that flashing a badge sometimes created more problems than it solved. People saw what they wanted to see, believed what confirmed their existing prejudices. His strength lay in his ability to stay focused on the mission, to rise above the daily indignities that came with being a black man in authority. As he settled into his seat near the emergency exit, Tom performed his usual pre-flight ritual, checking his medication, securing his evidence, and observing his surroundings. He noted the flight attendants, identifying the ones mentioned in his intelligence reports. Linda seemed professional and alert, while another crew member's behavior raised subtle red flags that his trained eye couldn't ignore. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. Beyond his official mission, he carried the weight of representation. Every action, every response would either challenge or confirm people's prejudices. Sarah had always said that changing hearts was harder than changing laws, but both were necessary for real justice. Let him watch, he thought, feeling Karen's suspicious gaze boring into him. Let him judge. He had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence, and the sweetest revenge was success. What no one on this flight realized was that their journey would become a testament to the destructive power of prejudice and the healing potential of understanding. Karen White hadn't always been the person who saw threats in every shadow. 3 years ago, she was a different woman, a mother who taught her daughter Emily to see the best in people. That changed on a sunny Tuesday when a terrorist attack at Emily's college campus took her only child away forever. The explosion that claimed 19 lives left behind a crater in both the earth and Karen's soul. The aftermath had transformed her from a compassionate high school counselor into someone she barely recognized. Sleepless nights were spent scrolling through news feeds, consuming every detail about similar attacks. Her once welcoming suburban home became a fortress of security cameras and triple-locked doors. Friends gradually stopped visiting, unable to breach the walls of paranoia she'd built around herself. It was during one of her late-night internet deep dives that Karen found the Citizens for American Safety group. Their message resonated with her grief-stricken mind. The world was dangerous, and vigilance was the only protection. What started as online discussions evolved into local meetings where she found others who understood her fear. They gave her pain a purpose, her suspicions a structure. What Karen didn't realize was how skillfully the organization manipulated her trauma. Each meeting pushed her further toward their extremist ideology, using her daughter's memory to fuel hatred against targeted groups. They painted a world of clear villains and victims, offering the illusion of control she desperately craved. The group became her new family, filling the void Emily's death had left. Her job at the high school had become impossible to maintain. Her increasing tendency to see threats in innocent situations, a student's oversized jacket, a foreign language conversation in the hallway, led to complaints. The administration's request for her to take extended leave felt like another betrayal. The organization welcomed her full-time involvement, giving her a sense of purpose through their surveillance training. Today's flight was supposed to be her first solo observation mission. The group had trained her to identify suspicious behaviors in public spaces. They praised her heightened awareness, calling it a gift rather than the paranoia her therapist had labeled it. The medication she'd stopped taking 6 months ago might have helped her see things differently, but the organization had convinced her that the pills dulled her natural protective instincts. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her magazine, unable to tear her eyes away from Tom Johnson. Everything about him triggered the warning signs she'd been taught to recognize: his careful movements, the frequent checks of his bag, the calm demeanor that must be hiding something sinister. The memory of Emily's last text message, "Love you, Mom. See you tonight," fueled her certainty that she needed to act. The other passengers' apparent unconcern only strengthened her resolve. Hadn't everyone been unconcerned that day at Emily's college, too? The organization's words echoed in her mind: if you see something, say something. Better to be wrong than sorry. They'd promised her that her vigilance could save lives, prevent other mothers from experiencing her pain. What Karen couldn't admit, even to herself, was how the constant vigilance exhausted her. In rare quiet moments, Emily's voice whispered in her memory gentle reminders of the compassionate woman she used to be. But those moments were quickly drowned out by fear, by the organization's carefully crafted messages that kept her in a state of perpetual alarm. The flight attendant's dismissal of her concerns felt like a familiar pattern, people refusing to see what was right in front of them. Karen's jaw clenched as she watched Tom check his bag again. This time would be different. This time someone would listen. She wouldn't let another tragedy happen, not when she had the power to prevent it. What she couldn't know was how this flight would force her to confront not just her fears, but the very foundations of her newfound beliefs. The Boeing 737 lifted smoothly into the morning sky, carrying its passengers away from New York's autumn chill. Tom Johnson settled into his seat by the emergency exit, methodically arranging his belongings. His fingers traced the familiar outline of his medication bottle through his bag, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the increasingly agitated woman 3 rows back. Linda Matthews, the lead flight attendant with 15 years of experience, began her routine cabin check. She caught the tension in Karen White's posture, the way her eyes never left the man by the emergency exit. After 2 decades in the air, Linda had developed a sixth sense for trouble, and something about Karen's focused surveillance set off warning bells. Among the crew, James Peterson, a newer flight attendant, watched the developing situation with hidden interest. His seemingly professional demeanor masked a deeper involvement in matters beyond routine airline service. He lingered near Karen's seat longer than necessary, subtly encouraging her growing unease with carefully chosen words about being vigilant in these troubled times. Tom maintained his calm exterior while keeping mental notes of the crew's movements. His trained eye noticed James's unusual behavior, the slight hesitation in his steps, the way his gaze lingered too long on certain passengers. These were details most would miss, but they confirmed intelligence about potential corrupt staff members. The cabin settled into its usual rhythm of service announcements and safety demonstrations, but beneath this routine facade, tensions were building. Karen's hand shot up every time a flight attendant passed, each interaction more insistent than the last. "Are you sure he's been properly screened?" she would whisper, her voice trembling with barely contained anxiety. Linda handled each question with professional patience, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was different from typical passenger anxiety. She noticed James hovering nearby during these exchanges, his presence somehow amplifying rather than calming Karen's concerns. Tom kept his focus on his book, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a choice that felt particularly poignant today. He maintained his practiced calm, but his mind raced through contingency plans. The flash drive hidden within his medication bottle contained evidence that could save dozens of lives. He couldn't risk any confrontation that might compromise its security. The air grew thicker with tension as Karen began whispering to neighboring passengers. "Did you see how he keeps checking that bag?" she murmured, her voice carrying just far enough for others to hear. "It's not normal. Nobody needs to check their bag that many times unless they're hiding something." Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, while others tried to ignore the mounting drama. A businessman 2 rows ahead put on his headphones, turning up the volume. A young mother pulled her curious child closer, avoiding eye contact with everyone involved. Linda approached Tom's seat, ostensibly to offer him a drink. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked quietly, her eyes conveying concern beyond the standard customer service inquiry. Tom nodded slightly, his voice low and steady. "I'm fine, thank you, just trying to keep things calm." Meanwhile, James made another pass through the cabin, pausing near Karen. "We take all passenger concerns seriously," he said, just loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Keep me informed if you notice anything unusual." His words seemed designed to validate her fears rather than allay them. The plane cruised at altitude, the gentle hum of engines a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence building inside the cabin. Tom checked his heart monitor discreetly. The numbers were elevated but manageable. He took a slow breath, remembering his training. Sometimes the hardest part of undercover work was maintaining composure in the face of ignorance and prejudice. Karen's knuckles whitened around her armrests as she watched Tom take his medication. In her mind, each pill he swallowed could be something sinister, each calm gesture a calculated act. The organization's training echoed in her thoughts. The most dangerous ones are those who appear most normal. As the flight progressed into its first hour, the cabin felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Linda exchanged worried glances with her fellow crew members, except for James, who seemed almost pleased with the growing tension. What none of them realized was that this flight would test not just their professional training, but their fundamental beliefs about human nature. The first direct confrontation erupted 90 minutes into the flight. Karen White could no longer contain her growing anxiety, rising suddenly from her seat. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharper than intended. "I need to speak with someone in charge. Now." Linda approached quickly, conscious of the heads turning throughout the cabin. "Ma, I am. Please lower your voice. How can I help you?" Her professional smile remained fixed, though her eyes darted briefly toward Tom Johnson, who continued reading his book with deliberate calmness. "That man," Karen hissed, pointing directly at Tom. "He's been acting suspiciously since takeoff. I've been watching him, checking his bag repeatedly, taking pills, looking too calm. It's not natural. Someone needs to do something before it's too late." Her voice cracked with barely controlled hysteria. James materialized beside them, his presence adding an undercurrent of validation to Karen's concerns. "Perhaps we should document these observations," he suggested smoothly. "In times like these, we can't be too careful." His words seemed to embolden Karen, whose voice grew louder. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly gentleman wearing a veteran's cap shook his head disapprovingly, while a young couple exchanged worried glances. A teenage girl began recording discreetly with her phone, the modern instinct to document drama overriding privacy concerns. Tom maintained his composure, though his heart monitor showed another slight elevation. He'd faced similar situations before, but never with so much at stake. The flash drive in his medication bottle contained evidence that could bring down an entire trafficking network. He couldn't risk any interference. Linda attempted to defuse the situation. I assure you all our passengers have been properly screened. If you have specific concerns, but Karen cut her off, her voice rising further. Specific concerns? He's been checking that bag like he's hiding something. And those pills, who knows what they really are? James nodded sympathetically. We take all passenger concerns seriously, he repeated, loud enough for nearby rows to hear. His eyes met Tom's briefly, a flash of something calculating in his gaze. Tom recognized it instantly, the look of someone playing both sides. A middle-aged woman behind Karen spoke up. I saw him take something from his bag earlier. It did seem odd. The support, though tentative, visibly encouraged Karen. Tom noticed James's subtle nod of approval at this development. Linda found herself in an increasingly difficult position. Sir, she addressed Tom directly, would you mind showing us your medication? Perhaps it would help ease some concerns. Her voice conveyed an apology even as she made the request. Tom looked up calmly, his voice steady. It's prescription heart medication, he explained, though he knew this wouldn't satisfy Karen. I'm happy to show you the label. He reached for his bag, movements deliberately slow and visible. Karen's reaction was immediate and explosive. Don't let him open it here, she exclaimed. What if there's something dangerous inside? Her outburst caused a young child to start crying, adding to the tension. The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath as Tom withdrew his medication bottle. Linda examined it carefully, aware of all eyes on this interaction. This is clearly labeled prescription medication, she confirmed, showing it to Karen. But Karen shook her head violently. That's what he wants you to think. Anyone can make a fake label. We're all in danger, and nobody's listening. Her voice rose to nearly a shout, prompting more passengers to start recording. James placed a reassuring hand on Karen's shoulder. We hear your concerns, he said, his tone carrying a hint of suggestion. Perhaps we should discuss this further in the galley. His eyes flickered briefly to Tom's bag, a gesture that didn't escape Tom's notice. Linda intervened again, her voice firmer now. Please return to your seat. We've addressed your concerns, and disrupting the flight will only create more problems. She positioned herself between Karen and Tom, a human barrier against escalating tension. The confrontation subsided temporarily, but the atmosphere remained charged. Karen returned to her seat, muttering about people's blindness to danger. Tom resumed his reading, though his senses remained alert. Both Linda and James retreated to the galley, but for very different reasons, one to manage a volatile situation, the other to advance an hidden agenda that was slowly beginning to unfold. Tom's unwavering composure in the face of prejudice and his dedication to justice deserves a like, yet sadly he hasn't received that recognition. Take a moment to show your support by hitting the like button and sharing your thoughts below. The tension in the cabin reached a new level as the flight entered its third hour. Karen had spent the last 30 minutes moving from seat to seat, whispering urgently to other passengers. Her nervous energy was infectious, spreading through the cabin like a virus. He's got something in that bag, she insisted. We can't just sit here and do nothing. James strategically positioned himself near clusters of concerned passengers, subtly reinforcing Karen's fears. In my experience, he would murmur, it's better to be safe than sorry. His uniform lent credibility to these subtle provocations, and more passengers began casting suspicious glances toward Tom. A small group formed near the back of the plane, a businessman who'd missed his last flight due to enhanced security screening, a retired teacher who'd lost a friend in a terrorist attack, and a young mother clutching her infant closer every time Tom moved. Their whispered conversations grew more animated, their theories more elaborate. Tom noticed the shifting dynamics but maintained his focus on his book. Years of undercover work had taught him to read a room without appearing to pay attention. He observed James's calculated movements, recognizing the telltale signs of someone working another angle. The flight attendant's behavior matched the intel about airline staff involved in the trafficking operation. Linda watched the situation deteriorating with growing concern. She'd seen nervous passengers before, but this felt orchestrated. James's involvement particularly troubled her. His actions seemed designed to escalate rather than calm the situation. During a brief moment in the galley, she attempted to question him. "Don't you think we should be diffusing this situation?" she asked. James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes passengers need to feel heard," he replied smoothly. "We don't want to dismiss legitimate concerns, do we?" Before Linda could respond, he was back in the cabin, subtly directing another passenger's attention to Tom's frequent bag checks. The atmosphere grew heavier as more passengers became involved. A college student started live streaming the situation discreetly, capturing Karen's increasingly frantic movements and the growing circle of concerned passengers. Social media was already picking up the story "Suspicious Behavior on Flight 287 Watch Live." Tom's heart monitor showed another spike, prompting him to reach for his medication. The simple action caused a ripple of whispers through the cabin. Karen's voice rose above the murmur. "See? There he goes again with those pills." Her words carried a tremor of triumph, as if each movement confirmed her worst suspicions. A sudden wave of turbulence sent shudders through the plane, causing Tom's bag to shift slightly under his seat. The simple movement triggered an immediate reaction. Karen jumped to her feet, pointing dramatically. "He's doing something with the bag. Someone needs to stop him." Linda moved quickly to intervene, but James got there first. "Sir," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "perhaps we should store your bag in the overhead compartment, for everyone's peace of mind." His suggestion carried an undercurrent of authority that made it sound more like a command. Tom met James's gaze steadily, reading the calculation behind the seemingly helpful gesture. "I'm sorry," he replied calmly, "but I need to keep my medication close." Doctor's orders. His voice remained level, but his hand moved slightly, ensuring the bag stayed firmly by his feet. The standoff drew more attention. Phones emerged from pockets, recording the interaction. Karen's group of supporters grew larger, their whispers more insistent. The retired teacher spoke up, her voice shaking. "We have a right to feel safe on this flight." Linda tried to regain control of the situation. "Everyone, please return to your seats. The captain has illuminated the fasten seatbelt sign," but her authority was undermined by James's continued presence near the concerned group, his subtle nods encouraging their fears. Tom could feel the situation approaching a tipping point. The evidence in his bag needed to reach Los Angeles intact. Lives depended on it. But revealing his identity now could compromise months of investigation and put the trafficking victims at even greater risk. He noticed James watching him intently, likely hoping for just such a revelation. The cabin had transformed into a pressure cooker of fear and suspicion. Karen's initial concerns had snowballed into a collective anxiety that threatened to overwhelm the normal protocols of civil air travel. Linda exchanged worried glances with other crew members, except for James, who seemed to be orchestrating the chaos with subtle precision. What none of them realized was that among the passengers was Sarah Chen, a quiet woman in row 23, who watched the scene unfold with growing recognition. As a survivor of trafficking herself, she recognized both Tom from a previous rescue operation and James from darker circumstances. But for now, she remained silent, understanding the delicate nature of undercover work. The flight was becoming a crucible where prejudice, fear, and hidden agendas collided. Tom maintained his composed exterior, but inside he calculated his options. Every minute brought them closer to Los Angeles, but also closer to a confrontation that could jeopardize everything. The evidence in his bag could bring down an entire trafficking network, but only if he could keep it secure for a few more hours. As the tension mounted, Linda made a decision. She needed to contact the captain about the situation. But as she moved toward the cockpit, James intercepted her. "I'll handle the passengers," he assured her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You should focus on service." His words were polite, but carried a subtle warning that made Linda pause. Something was very wrong with this situation, and she was beginning to suspect it went far beyond a simple case of passenger paranoia. The situation exploded when Tom stood up to use the restroom. "Now's our chance." Karen's voice cut through the cabin noise. "We need to check that bag." She launched from her seat, followed by several convinced passengers. The moment Tom stepped into the narrow bathroom, chaos erupted. James moved with practiced efficiency, positioning himself near Tom's seat. For everyone's safety, he announced loudly, perhaps we should examine the contents. His authoritative tone gave the mob the permission they'd been waiting for. Karen lunged forward, reaching for Tom's bag. Linda intervened, physically placing herself between the group and Tom's belongings. This is absolutely unauthorized, she declared firmly. Return to your seats immediately, or I will be forced to contact the authorities. But her words were drowned out by the chorus of agitated voices. The businessman who joined Karen's cause spoke up. We have a right to protect ourselves. If he has nothing to hide, why is he so protective of that bag? Others nodded in agreement, the mob mentality building momentum. Phones recorded the scene from multiple angles, live streaming the confrontation to an increasingly interested online audience. Tom emerged from the bathroom to find a wall of hostile faces surrounding his seat. His heart monitor beeped a warning, but he kept his voice steady. Please step away from my personal belongings, he requested calmly, though his eyes noted James's strategic position near his bag. Karen's face was flushed with vindication. If you're innocent, prove it. Open the bag right now, the retired teacher beside her added. We're not moving until we know we're safe. The young mother clutched her baby tighter, tears streaming down her face. Linda made one final attempt to restore order. This is a violation of passenger rights. Everyone return to your seats, or we will make an emergency landing. But James subtly undermined her authority, speaking in a tone that seemed reasonable yet inflammatory. Perhaps we should listen to their concerns. These are unusual times. Tom recognized the trap. If he refused to open the bag, it would confirm their suspicions. If he opened it, James would see the evidence hidden within the medication bottle. Either way, the trafficking operation would win. He needed a third option. Sarah Chin watched from her seat, her hands trembling as she recognized the tactics being used. She'd seen James before, in a place she tried to forget, but revealing this now could put both her and Tom in danger. She remained frozen, torn between helping and self-preservation. The confrontation reached its peak when Karen suddenly grabbed for the bag. Tom reacted instinctively, securing it before she could reach it. The sudden movement caused his heart monitor to emit a loud warning beep, drawing gasps from the crowd. See, Karen screamed. He's hiding something. Linda made an executive decision. Captain, she spoke urgently into her radio, we have a situation, but before she could continue, Tom raised his hand. The simple gesture, combined with his unwavering calm, somehow cut through the chaos. My name, he began quietly, is Thomas Johnson. This bag contains prescription heart medication, which I need to keep with me at all times. He slowly withdrew the bottle, holding it up for all to see. I understand your fears, but this is harassment based on prejudice, not fact. The word prejudice hung in the air, causing some passengers to shift uncomfortably. A few phones lowered, their owners suddenly less eager to document their participation. The young mother looked away, shame crossing her face. But Karen wasn't finished. The pills could be anything. We don't know what's really in that bottle. Her voice held a note of desperation now, as if she could feel her support wavering. James stood silently, watching the scene unfold with calculated interest. Tom maintained eye contact with Karen. Ma, I know you're scared. Fear makes us see threats everywhere. But sometimes the real threat isn't what we're looking at, it's what we're not seeing because we're too focused on our fears. The words seemed to strike something deep within Karen. For a moment, her certainty faltered. Images of Emily flashed through her mind, her daughter's smile, her openness to others, her disappointment at displays of prejudice. What would Emily think of her mother now? Linda seized the moment. Everyone, please return to your seats. This has gone far enough this time. The passengers began to move, the mob mentality breaking under the weight of shame and doubt. Even Karen stepped back, though her eyes still held suspicion. James withdrew smoothly, his attempt to expose the evidence thwarted for now. But Tom noticed the calculating look in his eyes. This wasn't over. The flight attendant's interest in the confrontation had confirmed Tom's suspicions about his involvement in the trafficking operation. As the aisle cleared and passengers settled back into their seats, an uncomfortable silence fell over the cabin. The confrontation had exposed something ugly, not the threat they'd imagined, but the threat of their own prejudices and fears. Some passengers busied themselves with magazines or screens, avoiding eye contact with their former allies. Tom returned to his seat, discreetly checking that the evidence remained secure. His heart rate slowly stabilized, but his mind raced. The confrontation had drawn too much attention. If James was indeed part of the trafficking operation, he would be looking for another opportunity. The question was, how many more hours until Los Angeles? Linda paused briefly by his seat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This never should have happened." Tom nodded slightly, but his attention was on James, who watched their interaction from the galley. The real danger wasn't the angry mob, it was the quiet observer who had orchestrated it all. The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through the cabin like aftershocks from an earthquake. The viral videos of the incident were already spreading across social media platforms, spawning hashtags and heated debates. Passengers who had filmed the scene were now adding their own commentary, framing the narrative according to their perspectives. Flight 287 began trending, with online observers taking sides without understanding the full context. Some labeled Tom as a victim of racial profiling, while others defended Karen's right to feel safe. The complexity of human fear and prejudice was being reduced to sound bites and angry tweets. In row 16, Michael Anderson, a civil rights attorney, watched the situation with growing professional interest. He'd witnessed similar scenarios unfold countless times, but rarely with such clarity. He observed how James subtly moved through the cabin, dropping carefully chosen words that kept the tension simmering just below boiling point. 2 rows behind Karen, Rebecca Thompson, a psychologist returning from a conference, recognized the patterns of mass hysteria taking shape. She saw how Karen's initial fear had infected others, creating a collective anxiety that fed on itself. The organization's manipulation of Karen's grief was textbook psychological exploitation. Near the back of the plane, Sarah Chin struggled with her own demons. Every time James passed her seat, she felt a flash of recognition and terror. She'd seen him before, in a basement in Queens where she'd been held with other trafficking victims. But revealing this now could endanger both her and Tom's mission. She gripped her armrests, fighting the urge to scream out the truth. Linda found herself increasingly isolated among the crew. Her attempts to maintain order were subtly undermined by James, who had positioned himself as the reasonable voice advocating for passenger concerns. Other flight attendants, unsure of the situation, began deferring to him instead of her. The social media storm intensified. Someone had recognized Tom from his previous work and posted about his role in other cases. His family began receiving threatening messages from anonymous accounts. His teenage daughter's school called about online harassment she was receiving from classmates who'd seen the videos. Karen's group had physically dispersed but remained connected through whispered conversations and meaningful glances. The retired teacher started a group chat with nearby passengers, sharing articles about similar incidents. The businessman used his laptop to research statistics about in-flight security breaches, his fear feeding on each new piece of data. Tom maintained his calm exterior, but the pressure was mounting. His phone buzzed with messages from his handler warning that the operation might be compromised. The trafficking ring would be monitoring social media, and the attention could put their victims in greater danger. Each like and share of the viral videos potentially pushed their targets deeper into hiding. Linda retreated to the galley to call the captain again, but found James already there, speaking quietly into his phone. She caught fragments of his conversation situation under control and proceeding as planned before he smoothly ended the call upon noticing her presence. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he brushed past her. The young mother who had supported Karen earlier now sat rigid in her seat, shame coloring her cheeks as she replayed her role in the confrontation. Her baby slept peacefully, unaware of how fear had momentarily transformed his mother into someone she didn't recognize. Online commentators began digging into Karen's background, uncovering her connection to the Citizens for American Safety group. Some painted her as a grieving mother manipulated by extremists, while others celebrated her as a vigilant citizen. Her personal tragedy became public fodder, dissected and judged by strangers. Rebecca Thompson watched Karen's increasing isolation with professional concern. She recognized the signs of someone approaching a psychological breaking point. The support that had momentarily validated Karen's fears was evaporating, leaving her alone with her demons. Michael Anderson documented everything on his tablet, recognizing the potential legal implications. The intersection of civil rights, public safety, and mass hysteria playing out in the confined space of an airplane cabin could become a landmark case study. Sarah Chin's hand shook as she wrote a note on an airsickness bag, documenting what she knew about James and the trafficking operation. If something happened to her or Tom, at least there would be evidence. She tucked it carefully into her jacket pocket, painfully aware of James's occasional glances in her direction. The tension had transformed from a loud confrontation to something more insidious, a quiet, simmering pressure that threatened to erupt at any moment. Each passenger carried their own fears, prejudices, and secrets, all contained within the pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet. Tom felt the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation. His training had prepared him for maintaining cover under pressure, but the added element of viral infamy complicated everything. One wrong move could not only compromise the operation but could become instant fodder for millions of online observers ready to judge and condemn. As the flight continued toward Los Angeles, the cabin had become a microcosm of society's deeper issues: fear, prejudice, manipulation, and the struggle for truth in an age of viral misinformation. Each passenger had become an unwitting player in a drama that was simultaneously intensely personal and unavoidably public. Linda's suspicions about James crystallized during a seemingly innocent interaction in the galley. She'd caught him sending encrypted messages on a second phone, a clear violation of crew protocols. When confronted, his explanation was too smooth, too rehearsed. "Just updating my supervisor about the situation," he claimed, but Linda had seen similar messages during other flights where passengers had mysteriously missed their connections. Working methodically through her service routine, Linda began piecing together patterns from previous flights. There had been other incidents where James had inflamed passenger tensions, always involving specific seats, specific routes. She carefully documented her observations in the flight log, marking times and seat numbers while maintaining a professional facade. Meanwhile, Sarah Chin had gathered her courage and managed to slip a note to Linda during drink service. "Flight attendant James Peterson, trafficking connection, Queens basement, May 2023, it read. Linda's hand trembled slightly as she pocketed the note, maintaining her composed expression even as her mind raced with the implications. Tom observed these developments while appearing absorbed in his book. His trained eye caught the subtle changes in Linda's behavior, the way she now positioned herself between James and certain passengers. He noticed Sarah Chin's furtive movements and recognized her from case files, a rescued victim whose testimony had been crucial in breaking up a Queens trafficking operation. Karen's isolation had deepened, but her forced solitude led to unexpected observations. From her seat, she watched James's interactions with increasing confusion. His constant movement through the cabin seemed less about passenger service and more about surveillance. The organization's training had taught her to look for threats, but what if she'd been looking in the wrong direction? The businessman who'd supported Karen earlier, Edward Roberts, began to have his own doubts. His corporate security background flagged James's behavior as suspicious. The controlled chaos, the strategic positioning, the secondary phone. He started taking notes on his laptop, documenting patterns that seemed increasingly orchestrated. In the cockpit, Captain David Miller received Linda's coded message about crew protocol violations. As a former Air Force pilot, he recognized the signs of something larger at play. He discreetly alerted air traffic control to possible security concerns, careful to avoid causing panic while ensuring ground authorities would be ready. James became aware that his control of the situation was slipping. He noticed Linda's increased scrutiny, the way certain passengers were watching him instead of Tom. His messages to his handlers became more frequent, more urgent. The operation was at risk of exposure and contingency plans needed to be activated. Sarah Chin's presence on the flight had not been accidental. She'd been working with law enforcement, helping identify trafficking routes and compromised airline staff. Her testimony could connect James to multiple trafficking operations, but only if they all made it to Los Angeles safely. Rebecca Thompson, the psychologist, observed the shifting dynamics with professional interest. She noticed how Karen's focused suspicion of Tom had begun to waver as she observed James's behavior. The psychologist recognized the cognitive dissonance Karen was experiencing as her carefully constructed worldview began to crack. Linda managed to create a moment of private communication with Tom during beverage service. Second phone, encrypted messages, possible connection to Queen's operation, she murmured, appearing to discuss drink options. Tom's slight nod confirmed her suspicions while maintaining their cover. James noticed the private exchange and moved to intervene, but Edward Roberts chose that moment to request assistance with his laptop, deliberately creating a distraction. The businessman had served in military intelligence before his corporate career, and his instincts told him to trust Linda over James. The evidence against James mounted suspicious phone activity, pattern of flight assignments matching known trafficking routes, strategic manipulation of passenger fears. Linda documented everything, knowing each detail could be crucial for prosecution. Karen watched this complex dance of surveillance and counter-surveillance unfold around her. The organization had trained her to see threats everywhere, but they'd never suggested that the threats might wear uniforms and friendly smiles. Her certainty began to crumble as she recognized the tactical manipulation that had shaped her own fears. Tom realized that the situation had evolved beyond protecting his cover. The presence of both James and Sarah Chen on this flight suggested something larger, perhaps a major trafficking operation planning to move multiple victims. His mission parameters might need to adjust to this new intelligence. As the flight progressed, the cabin had become a complex web of hidden alliances and agendas. Every service interaction, every casual movement carried deeper significance. The original confrontation had inadvertently exposed a layer of criminal activity that had been hiding in plain sight, protected by the very fears and prejudices it helped cultivate. Linda made another cautious round through the cabin, noting how James's behavior grew more agitated as his control of the situation deteriorated. The careful manipulation of passenger fears had backfired, drawing unwanted attention to his own suspicious activities. The hunter had become the hunted, though few passengers realized how the dynamics had shifted. The situation exploded 2 hours before landing when James made his fatal mistake. During a routine cabin check, he deliberately bumped into Tom's seat, causing the medication bag to spill. The calculated move backfired spectacularly when Sarah Chen's voice cut through the cabin. "I know him. He was there in Queens." The cabin froze. James's face flickered with recognition before his professional mask slipped back into place. But it was too late. Linda had seen the exchange and Tom was already moving. The choreography of confrontation that followed would be replayed on news channels for weeks. Karen, who had been watching James's increasingly erratic behavior, stood up abruptly. "What's happening in Queens?" Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone realizing they'd been manipulated. The organization's warnings about hidden threats suddenly took on a different meaning. Tom maintained his cover for precisely 3 more seconds, until James reached for what was clearly a concealed weapon. In one fluid motion, Tom produced his badge. "NYPD Special Investigations. Everyone stay in your seats." The authority in his voice froze even the most anxious passengers. James tried to retreat toward the galley, but Linda blocked his path. Other flight attendants, now understanding her earlier concerns, moved to secure the cabin's exits. The trapped trafficking facilitator looked desperately for an escape route, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. "He's part of a human trafficking ring," Sarah Chen announced, her voice trembling but clear. "I was one of their victims. Detective Johnson helped rescue me and others from a basement in Queens." The revelation sent shockwaves through the cabin. Passengers, who had been suspicious of Tom, now stared at James with horror. Karen's world tilted on its axis. The organization had trained her to spot threats, to protect others from experiencing her loss. Instead, they had turned her fear into a weapon, using her grief to help criminals hide in plain sight. "You used us," she whispered, then louder, "You used our fear." James made one last desperate attempt. "She's lying. This is what we warned you about. They're all working together to deceive you," but his words fell flat. The passengers who had earlier formed a mob now backed away from him, seeing the true face of manipulation. Tom kept his weapon trained on James while speaking calmly to the cabin. "This man is part of a trafficking operation that uses compromised airline staff to move victims across state lines. They manipulate passenger fears to create distractions and maintain their cover." Linda retrieved James's second phone, which he'd dropped in the confusion. "Captain," she spoke into her radio, "we have confirmation of crew involvement in trafficking activities. Subject is contained, requesting priority landing and law enforcement presence." The businessman, Edward Roberts, stood up. "I'm a former military intelligence officer. I can assist in restraining the suspect." His offer represented a complete reversal of his earlier suspicions, a transformation mirrored across the cabin. Sarah Chin's hands shook as she continued her testimony. "They use flights like this one to move girls across the country. The organization that recruited Karen, they're connected. They create chaos to hide their real operations." Her words struck Karen like physical blows. The young mother who had feared Tom now cried quietly, clutching her baby. The retired teacher who had joined Karen's crusade sat with her head in her hands. The viral videos that had painted Tom as a threat were rapidly being updated with new context, new understanding. James, seeing his options disappear, made a final desperate move. He lunged toward Sarah, perhaps hoping to use her as leverage. Tom's response was immediate and precise, tackling him to the aisle floor. The takedown was professional, controlled everything James's manipulation had not been. As Linda and Edward Roberts helped secure James with plastic restraints, Karen approached Tom. Her face showed the devastation of someone whose entire worldview had shattered. "My daughter," she began, voice breaking. "I thought I was preventing other mothers from experiencing my loss. Instead, I helped them hurt other people's daughters." Tom's response was compassionate but firm. "They manipulated your grief, Mrs. White. They turned your pain into a tool for their operation. But now you can help us stop them." The words offered both understanding and redemption. Sarah Chin moved to Karen's side, an unexpected alliance forming between the grieving mother and the trafficking survivor. "Your fear was real," Sarah said softly. "They just taught you to aim it at the wrong people." The cabin atmosphere transformed from tension to a shared sense of purpose. Passengers who had been divided by manufactured fear now united in support of justice. Linda coordinated with the flight crew to document statements while maintaining cabin security. James sat restrained, his carefully constructed world of manipulation collapsing around him. The same passengers he had hoped to use as unwitting accomplices now watched him with a combination of disgust and enlightened understanding. The revelation had exposed not just a criminal operation, but the deeper truth about how fear and prejudice can be weaponized. Tom's calm professionalism, which had earlier seemed suspicious, now stood in stark contrast to James's unraveling facade. The flight continued toward Los Angeles, but the cabin dynamics had fundamentally shifted. A community forged through shared understanding had replaced the mob mentality of fear. The real threat had been exposed, and with it came the possibility of healing and redemption. Tom kept a watchful eye on James while accepting the quiet apologies of passengers who had doubted him. But his focus remained on the larger mission. This arrest would help dismantle a trafficking network that had exploited social fears for far too long. The next 30 minutes on Flight 287 unfolded like scenes from a carefully orchestrated drama, but with raw emotions that no script could capture. As James sat restrained in the back galley, Linda coordinated with ground authorities through the cockpit. The cabin buzzed with a complex mixture of shame, relief, and dawning understanding. Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been granted priority landing at LAX. Please remain calm and seated. Law enforcement will meet us upon arrival." The announcement carried the weight of unspoken gravity. Sarah Chin began sharing her story quietly with those around her, each word a testimony to both human cruelty and resilience. "They use these flights regularly," she explained. "The organization that recruited Karen, they deliberately target people who've experienced trauma. They turn victims into unwitting accomplices." Karen sat rigid in her seat, tears streaming silently down her face as she listened. Every word from Sarah illuminated how completely she'd been manipulated. The organization had identified her vulnerability after Emily's death, shaped her fear into a weapon, and used her to help perpetuate the very kind of suffering she'd wanted to prevent. Tom moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, gathering preliminary statements while maintaining security. His interaction with each passenger carried a gentle authority that stood in sharp contrast to their earlier suspicions. "Your statements will help us dismantle their entire network," he assured them. Linda discovered more evidence while securing James's belongings. Flight manifests with coded annotations, schedules of future trafficking routes, lists of potential recruits for their fear-mongering organization. Each document revealed layers of calculated manipulation that had been hiding in plain sight. The young mother who had feared Tom approached him, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I teach my son not to judge others, yet I let fear cloud my own judgment." Tom's response was kind. Fear is a powerful tool in the wrong hands. What matters is learning from it. Edward Roberts had taken charge of documenting everything on his laptop, his corporate security experience proving valuable. They exploited standard security protocols, he explained to nearby passengers. Used our heightened awareness against us. Brilliant but devastating in its simplicity. The retired teacher, who had been one of Karen's strongest supporters, now sat with Sarah, listening intently. Her educator's instinct to understand and learn transformed her shame into determination to help. "We need to teach people how to recognize this kind of manipulation," she declared. Online, the story was evolving rapidly. Passengers' updated posts began revealing the deeper truth, transforming the narrative from one of suspicious behavior to an expose of trafficking tactics. The same viral reach that had initially threatened Tom now worked to uncover the truth. Rebecca Thompson, the psychologist, moved quietly among the passengers, offering support to those struggling to process the revelations. Her professional insight helped people understand how their fears had been weaponized against them. "Healing begins with understanding," she reminded them. James remained silent in his restraints, but his eyes tracked every movement in the cabin. The skilled manipulator had become the observed, his techniques exposed to the very audience he'd tried to deceive. Linda ensured he remained isolated, preventing any last attempts at manipulation. Sarah Chin's presence on the flight proved to be more than coincidence. She had been working with law enforcement, helping identify trafficking patterns. "I chose to face my fears," she explained to Karen, "to prevent others from experiencing what I did. You can make the same choice." The cabin crew, following Linda's lead, maintained professional composure while dealing with their own shock at James's betrayal. Their trained routines provided a sense of normalcy that helped calm the passengers as they processed the events. Tom received updates from his team on the ground. Multiple arrests were already in progress, targeting both trafficking operations and their fear-mongering recruitment network. The evidence on Flight 287 would help connect all the pieces. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from tension to a shared sense of purpose. Passengers who had been divided by manufactured fear now united in their determination to help expose the truth. Even those who had been most suspicious of Tom now offered their support and statements. As they began their descent into Los Angeles, Linda made a final cabin check. She paused briefly beside Tom. "I've seen a lot in my career," she said quietly, "but nothing quite like this." Tom nodded, understanding that the flight had revealed not just a criminal operation, but the deeper truths about human nature. The Los Angeles skyline appeared through the windows, a reminder that this intense experience was nearing its end. But for everyone on Flight 287, the impact would resonate long after landing. They had witnessed how easily fear could be manipulated, but also how truth and understanding could overcome prejudice. If you've been moved by this powerful story of redemption and justice, we invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful narratives that challenge prejudices and inspire positive change in our society. Together, we can make a difference. The descent into Los Angeles brought no relief from the emotional turbulence that had transformed Flight 287. As passenger phones reconnected to networks, the full impact of the viral incident began to emerge. Tom's daughter had left a tearful voicemail. She'd been forced to leave school early due to harassment from classmates who'd seen the videos. His wife faced hostile-style stares at her hospital nursing shift. Karen's hands shook as she scrolled through her notifications. The organization she'd trusted had already begun distancing itself, painting her as an overzealous member who didn't represent their values. Her social media accounts flooded with both hatred and misguided support, each comment a fresh reminder of her manipulation. Sarah Chin received urgent messages from her victims' support group. Other survivors were being threatened, their safe houses possibly compromised. The trafficking network's exposure had sparked a desperate scramble to silence potential witnesses. Her hands trembled as she forwarded the warnings to Tom. Linda discovered her airline career might be in jeopardy. Despite acting correctly, the viral nature of the incident and her involvement in restraining a fellow crew member had drawn unwanted corporate scrutiny. Messages from her supervisor suggested an impending investigation into her handling of the situation. Tom's operation, months in the making, now faced unexpected complications. The premature exposure meant some trafficking routes would go dark, victims would be moved, and evidence might be destroyed. Each ping of his phone brought news of another safe house found empty, another witness gone silent. The young mother who'd joined Karen's fears now faced her own social media backlash. Videos showed her angry accusations, her frightened clutching of her child away from Tom. Mommy bloggers were already crafting think pieces about racism and parenting. Her tears fell silently as she deleted her social accounts. Edward Roberts received an urgent call from his corporate office. His involvement in restraining James, though justified, had been filmed and shared widely. The company's legal team worried about liability issues. His planned promotion now hung in uncertain balance. Rebecca Thompson, the psychologist, recognized the signs of trauma rippling through the cabin. The passengers had not only witnessed a confrontation but had been forced to confront their own biases and fears. Some sat in shocked silence, others compulsively checked their phones, all showing signs of acute stress. James's arrest would trigger investigations into other crew members, affecting morale and trust throughout the airline industry. Linda overheard flight attendants from other crews already discussing fear and suspicion of their colleagues. The poison of doubt had spread beyond Flight 287. Captain Miller received word that his decision to grant Linda's requests and support Tom's actions would face review. Despite following protocol, the airline's concern about public relations and potential lawsuits overshadowed his judgment calls. The retired teacher faced messages from former colleagues and students, some expressing disappointment in her recorded behavior. Her reputation as an educator who taught inclusion and understanding now seemed tarnished by moments of recorded prejudice. Karen's phone displayed a photo of Emily, her daughter's smiling face, a reminder of how grief had been weaponized. The organization had taken her most sacred pain and twisted it into a tool for harming other mothers' daughters. The realization brought fresh waves of anguish. Sarah's childhood trauma, carefully managed through years of therapy, had been unexpectedly triggered. Seeing James, confronting her past publicly, had reopened wounds she thought had healed. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, even as she helped document evidence. Tom's heart condition, typically well managed, showed the strain of the day's events. His monitor beeped more frequently, each alert a reminder of the physical cost of his dedication to justice. The medication that had sparked the initial suspicion now became urgently necessary. As the plane descended through layers of clouds, each passenger carried their own weight of consequences. The viral videos, tweets, and posts had transformed a single flight into a public spectacle, each participant now facing judgment from a world eager to condemn but slow to understand. The true devastation emerged during the final 30 minutes of flight. As James sat restrained, FBI agents on the ground began sending preliminary findings to Tom. The organization that had recruited Karen wasn't just supporting trafficking operations, they had direct connections to Emily's death. The terrorist attack that killed Karen's daughter had been orchestrated to create precisely the kind of grieving, vulnerable targets they could manipulate. Sarah Chin's hands shook as she revealed more details about the Queen's operation. James hadn't just been a facilitator, he had been one of the key architects of using commercial flights for trafficking. The revelation that other crew members on various airlines were involved sent shockwaves through the cabin crew. Linda received an urgent message 3 other flight attendants she'd worked with were being taken into custody at different airports. Tom's investigation had unknowingly scratched the surface of something far larger. The evidence in his medication bottle wasn't just about one trafficking ring, it contained data linking multiple extremist groups, trafficking operations, and corrupt officials. The organization had created a sophisticated network that turned tragedy into opportunity, systematically identifying and recruiting grieving individuals. Karen's phone buzzed with a message that shattered her remaining defenses. A contact within the organization had accidentally forwarded an internal memo discussing how they had monitored her social media after Emily's death, calculating the perfect moment to make contact. They had studied her grief like predators studying prey. The retired teacher discovered through news alerts that her local chapter of the organization had been operating out of a building next to an elementary school, using proximity to children to identify and manipulate more worried parents. Her years of unwitting involvement had helped them establish credibility in the community. Edward Roberts received intelligence from his corporate security contacts revealing that his own company's anti-terrorism protocols had been subtly influenced by the organization's recommendations, effectively building bias into institutional systems. The realization of how deep the manipulation went left him questioning his entire career. Linda uncovered messages on James's phone showing how he had orchestrated similar incidents on other flights, using manufactured fear to divert attention from trafficking operations. Each manipulated confrontation had been documented and used to train other corrupt crew members. Rebecca Thompson's professional training helped her identify the sophisticated psychological tactics employed. The organization hadn't just exploited fear, they had created a comprehensive system for manufacturing and directing it, turning ordinary people into unwitting accomplices in human trafficking. Sarah's testimony revealed how the organization specifically targeted flights with grieving or traumatized passengers, using their emotional vulnerability to create distractions. The same tactics that had worked on Karen had been refined through countless similar manipulations. The young mother discovered through social media that her mommy blog had been secretly monitored by the organization, her posts about travel anxiety used to identify potential recruits. Her platform had unknowingly helped them map vulnerable targets. Tom received the most devastating update just before landing. The organization had specifically arranged for both him and Sarah to be on this flight, hoping to eliminate 2 key witnesses while testing new manipulation tactics. The entire confrontation had been orchestrated, with James playing his part to perfection until it backfired. Captain Miller learned that his airline security protocols had been partially written by consultants connected to the organization, systematically building in blind spots that facilitated trafficking. Every safety procedure he'd trusted now needed reevaluation. Karen, scrolling through her phone, found archived emails revealing that the organization had photographed her visiting Emily's grave, studying her mourning patterns to optimize their recruitment approach. They had turned her most private moments of grief into tactical data. The full scope of the revelation left the cabin in stunned silence. What had seemed like a simple case of prejudice and fear had exposed a complex web of exploitation that connected everyone on board in ways they never could have imagined. Personal tragedies had been transformed into tools, individual fears into weapons, and human vulnerability into tactical advantages. As the plane began its final descent into Los Angeles, each passenger grappled with their unwitting role in a system designed to turn human suffering into profit. The organization hadn't just manipulated their fears, it had architected them, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of suspicion and exploitation that had nearly succeeded in consuming them all. The revelation exploded across media channels as Flight 287 touched down at LAX. FBI agents had synchronized raids occurring across 12 states, targeting the organization's network of recruiters, traffickers, and corrupt officials. The evidence from Tom's medication bottle had provided the final links needed to expose the entire operation. Sarah Chin's testimony, broadcast live from the airport terminal, stunned the nation. She detailed how the organization systematically identified grieving individuals, studying their social media patterns to perfect their recruitment timing. Emily's death, she revealed, had been one of several strategically exploited tragedies used to create a network of unwitting accomplices. James broke under questioning, revealing how the organization had infiltrated airlines, security firms, and even grief counseling centers. Their methodology was brilliant in its cruelty, using genuine trauma to blind people to their participation in causing more trauma. His confession implicated dozens of other corrupt airline staff across multiple carriers. Linda's detailed flight logs, combined with Edward Roberts' corporate security analysis, exposed how the organization had manipulated airline security protocols. They had created a system where increased security measures actually facilitated trafficking by directing attention toward manufactured threats while creating blind spots for their operations. Karen's personal emails and records, voluntarily shared with investigators, revealed the organization's sophisticated manipulation tactics. They had monitored her visits to Emily's grave, analyzed her social media grief posts, and calculated precisely when to approach her with their message of preventing other tragedies. The Retired Teachers Community Connections helped expose how the organization had used schools and parent groups to identify potential recruits. They specifically targeted people with strong community ties, using their respectability to legitimize their message of fear and suspicion. Tom's investigation revealed the organization's true genius. They hadn't just exploited existing prejudices, they had engineered them. Each viral video of confrontation, each social media outbreak of fear, had been carefully orchestrated to create more opportunities for exploitation. Rebecca Thompson's psychological analysis of their recruitment materials exposed their methodology. They had developed a sophisticated understanding of trauma response, using it to create a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and manipulation that turned victims into unwitting perpetrators. The Young Mother's Mommy blog became evidence of how they monitored parenting communities, identifying and exploiting common anxieties. Her viral video of confronting Tom had been exactly what they wanted: content that spread fear while distracting from their real operations. Captain Miller's testimony about compromised airline protocols led to immediate industry-wide security reviews. Airlines across the country began examining their procedures, uncovering similar infiltrations in their systems. The FBI's coordinated raids recovered not just trafficking victims but extensive databases of potential recruits. The organization had created detailed psychological profiles of thousands of grieving individuals, calculating their potential usefulness in facilitating trafficking operations. Media coverage shifted dramatically as the full scope emerged. What had started as a viral video about prejudice on a plane became an expose of systematic exploitation of human grief. Journalists traced connections between seemingly unrelated incidents, finding the organization's fingerprints on numerous manufactured confrontations. The evidence showed how they had created a perfect cycle: exploit tragedy to recruit grieving individuals, use their genuine pain to create distractions, exploit those distractions to traffic more victims, create more tragedy, and find more recruits. Each element reinforced the others, creating an ever-expanding network of exploitation. Sarah's continued testimony revealed how the organization specifically targeted flights, using the confined space and heightened security tensions to their advantage. They had turned airport security theater into a tool for their operations, using increased vigilance to mask their actual activities. As the conspiracy unraveled, the true depth of the organization's infiltration became clear. They hadn't just created a trafficking operation, they had engineered a social environment that facilitated it, turning public fear into private profit while hiding behind a mask of security concerns. The unexpected alliances formed in the aftermath of Flight 287 transformed a tragedy into a movement for change. Karen and Sarah Chen, despite their vastly different experiences, became powerful advocates together. Their joint testimonies before Congress brought unprecedented attention to how trauma can be weaponized by criminal organizations. Linda's professional reputation, initially threatened, was restored when her meticulous documentation helped identify corrupt crew members across multiple airlines. She developed new training programs with Tom's assistance, teaching flight crews to recognize the difference between genuine security concerns and manufactured fear. The Young Mother transformed her mommy blog into a platform for discussing how parental fears can be manipulated. Her honest accounting of her experience on Flight 287 sparked important conversations about prejudice and parenting. She and Karen began co-hosting workshops about recognizing and resisting fear-based manipulation. Edward Roberts leveraged his corporate connections to create a task force examining how security protocols could be reformed without enabling discrimination. His collaboration with Tom led to the development of new guidelines that protected both security and civil rights, adopted by companies nationwide. Rebecca Thompson's psychological insights proved invaluable in developing intervention programs. Working with Sarah Chen, she created support groups specifically for individuals who had been manipulated through their trauma, helping them process both their original grief and their unwitting involvement in causing harm to others. The retired teacher returned to education with a new mission, developing curriculum materials about recognizing manipulation and preventing the weaponization of fear. Her programs, created in consultation with Karen and Sarah, were adopted by schools across the country. Tom's department established a specialized unit focusing on the intersection of trafficking and social manipulation. His team's work, supported by Sarah's insights and Karen's experience, created new protocols for identifying and preventing the exploitation of grieving individuals. Captain Miller worked with Linda to revolutionize airline security training, incorporating lessons from Flight 287 into standard procedures. Their collaborative approach emphasized the importance of distinguishing between real threats and manufactured distractions. Sarah Chin's Survivors Network expanded to include both trafficking victims and those who had been manipulated into supporting trafficking operations. The group provided a unique space for healing, understanding, and prevention, bridging divides between different types of trauma. The passengers of Flight 287 maintained connections, forming a support group that met monthly to discuss their experiences and help others recognize manipulation tactics. Their testimonies became powerful tools in fighting both trafficking and prejudice. Linda and Tom developed a close professional relationship, combining their expertise to train law enforcement and transportation workers in recognizing complex trafficking operations. Their program became a model for interagency cooperation. Karen found purpose in working with other grieving parents, helping them resist exploitation while honoring their lost loved ones. Her bond with Sarah grew stronger as they worked together to prevent others from experiencing either of their traumas. The young mother and Karen collaborated on a book about their experiences, offering a raw, honest look at how fear can blind people to manipulation. Their story became required reading in criminal justice and psychology programs. Rebecca Thompson's research into the psychology of manufactured fear led to breakthrough treatments for trauma survivors. Her work with the Flight 287 group provided valuable insights into how community support could prevent exploitation. Edward Roberts used his business influence to create corporate citizenship programs that addressed both security and social responsibility. His partnership with Tom's unit demonstrated how private sector resources could support law enforcement without compromising civil rights. As these alliances strengthened, they created a powerful network for identifying and preventing similar exploitation schemes. The passengers of Flight 287 had transformed from unwitting participants in a trafficking operation to active agents of positive change, but their collective experience became a case study in how confronting uncomfortable truths about prejudice and manipulation could lead to meaningful reform. The flight that began in fear and suspicion had created lasting bonds between unlikely allies, all committed to preventing others from being exploited through their pain. Through their various collaborations, they demonstrated how different perspectives and experiences could combine to create effective solutions. Their story proved that healing was possible not just for individuals but for communities affected by fear and manipulation. 1 year after Flight 287, the transformed terminal at LAX hosted a unique reunion. The passengers, who had once been divided by manufactured fear, now gathered to celebrate the impact of their shared experience. Karen and Sarah stood together at a podium, their unlikely friendship a testament to healing and understanding. The trafficking network had been dismantled, with over 200 victims rescued across multiple states. James and his co-conspirators faced lengthy prison sentences, their testimony exposing even deeper connections between extremist groups and trafficking operations. The organization that had manipulated Karen was dissolved, its assets seized and redirected to support victim services. Tom's evidence had led to systemic changes in airline security protocols nationwide. His heart condition, once used as cover, had improved with reduced stress. His family had moved past the social media backlash, finding support in the community that emerged from Flight 287's passengers. Linda's training program had been implemented across multiple airlines, creating a new standard for distinguishing between genuine security concerns and manufactured distractions. Her career had not only survived but flourished, as she became a leading voice in airline security reform. The young mother's blog had evolved into a powerful platform for discussing prejudice and parenting, reaching millions with messages of awareness and understanding. Her honest accounts of confronting her own biases helped other parents navigate similar challenges. Edward Roberts' corporate security reforms had been adopted by companies nationwide, creating a model for balancing safety with civil rights. His promotion had come through enhanced by his role in developing these new standards. Rebecca Thompson's trauma intervention programs had helped hundreds of individuals manipulated through their grief, preventing further exploitation of vulnerable people. Her research had led to new understanding of how trauma could be protected rather than weaponized. The retired teacher's educational materials about recognizing manipulation had become part of standard curricula across the country. Her work with students helped create a more aware and resistant generation. Sarah Chin's Survivor Network had expanded internationally, creating safe spaces for both trafficking victims and those manipulated into supporting trafficking operations. Her testimony had inspired other survivors to come forward, strengthening cases against trafficking networks worldwide. Karen had found purpose in helping other grieving parents resist exploitation, transforming her pain into protection for others. Her daughter's memory now inspired healing rather than fear, becoming a symbol of positive change rather than manipulation. Captain Miller's reformed flight protocols had been adopted industry-wide, creating safer skies without compromising civil rights. His decisions during Flight 287 were now taught as exemplary crisis management. The Passengers Support Group had evolved into a formal organization, providing resources and education about recognizing and resisting manipulation through fear. Their shared experience had created lasting bonds that continued to strengthen. As they gathered at LAX, each participant carried stories of transformation. What began as a flight marked by suspicion and fear had become a catalyst for positive change, demonstrating how confronting uncomfortable truths could lead to meaningful reform. Their collective journey from unknowing participants in exploitation to active agents of change proved that healing was possible not just for individuals, but for entire communities affected by fear and manipulation. At the reunion's closing ceremony, Karen stood beside Tom, their unlikely partnership symbolizing the event's deeper message. Emily always saw the best in people, she began, her voice steady. Today we honor her memory not through fear, but through understanding. The gathered crowd, once divided by manufactured suspicions, nodded in unified appreciation. Sarah Chin announced the opening of the first comprehensive healing center, combining support for trafficking survivors with programs for those manipulated by fear. The facility, named Emily's Light, would serve as a model for similar centers nationwide, turning places of trauma into spaces of transformation. Linda revealed that airline security training now included a mandatory section called the 287 Protocol, teaching crews to recognize the difference between genuine threats and manufactured fear. The program had already prevented several trafficking attempts and reduced incidents of bias-motivated confrontations. The Young Mother's blog had evolved into a successful book series about confronting prejudice in parenting, with forewords by both Karen and Tom. Her honest exploration of how fear had nearly led her to teach her child the wrong lessons resonated with parents worldwide. Edward Roberts shared how corporate security policies had been revolutionized, prioritizing human dignity alongside safety. His company's new approach, developed in consultation with Tom and Sarah, became an industry standard for ethical security practices. Rebecca Thompson presented research showing how their support network had helped hundreds of grieving individuals resist manipulation, breaking the cycle of weaponized trauma. The model was being adopted by grief counseling centers across the country. The retired teacher's curriculum about recognizing manipulation had reached thousands of students, creating a new generation armed against fear-based exploitation. Her work with Karen helped young people understand how grief could be protected rather than perverted. As the ceremony concluded, Tom shared the most powerful message: what happened on Flight 287 wasn't just about exposing a criminal network. It was about showing how fear can blind us to our common humanity, and how understanding can restore our sight. The event ended with the announcement of a National Awareness Day dedicated to recognizing and resisting the weaponization of fear. The date chosen was the anniversary of Flight 287, transforming a day of confusion and prejudice into one of understanding and hope. Beyond the formal speeches and announcements, small moments revealed the true impact of their journey. Karen and Sarah sharing a quiet embrace, their different paths of pain leading to shared healing. The young mother's child playing freely with others, unburdened by inherited fears. Tom watching it all with quiet satisfaction, his heart monitor showing the steady rhythm of peace. As the gathering dispersed, each participant carried forward a profound understanding that the greatest threat to humanity isn't our differences, but our failure to recognize our common vulnerability to fear and manipulation. Flight 287's legacy would live on not just in changed protocols and policies, but in the countless small moments when people chose understanding over suspicion, connection over division, and hope over fear. The transformed terminal at LAX stood as a testament to their journey. Its walls now bearing a simple plaque here: fear was transformed into understanding and strangers became family. May all who pass through remember the lessons of Flight 287. Thank you for experiencing this powerful journey with us. If this story of redemption, justice, and human connection has touched you, please consider subscribing to our channel to support our team's dedication to meaningful storytelling. Share this video with friends and family who might find hope in its message. Hit the like button and leave your thoughts in the comments below. How did this story impact you? Would you like to hear part 2? Exploring the aftermath of Flight 287 and the continued journey of these remarkable characters? Your engagement helps us continue creating content that matters.